Hello everyone, thank you for watching my channel today. And so today we're going to talk about defenses, and in particular we're going to talk about the insanity defense. To start off, we're going to talk about insanity. What is it? It means that at the time of the crime you were so impaired by mental illness or retardation as to be insane within the meaning of the law. So there is this legal meaning of insanity, and right now we're going to look at what that legal meaning is. You have to pass certain tests and you have to have this background, right? So we're going to distinguish a competency to stand trial as opposed to diminished capacity. So what is incompetency? It means you cannot stand trial. At the time of trial, you are so mentally disturbed, you are so upset, you might have PTSD from surviving an intense moment that they will postpone the trial for you, and that's incompetent to stand trial. There's also diminished capacity. That means that you do not have the mental ability to defend yourself or to even stand trial. You could be so mentally challenged or gone that there's just no way to even stand trial, and that would be an insanity defense as well, and you would lack the necessary mens rea to even commit a crime at that point. So now we're going to talk about the approaches to insanity defense and the analysis. We need to talk about sufficient impairment. Is there sufficient impairment, or whether or not the impairment so affected the defendant as to meet the legal standard. So there's a legal standard of what that means, and so we're going to talk about what mental illness or disease is. It's basically severe mental disease or a defect is required. So, and what is psychopathic personalities? That means that the insanity defense cannot be based upon an abnormality manifested only by repeated criminal or otherwise antisocial conduct. That means that basically your insanity when you committed the crime is not due to the fact that you've repeatedly lied or you've repeatedly stolen. Maybe you started off stealing candy and then you graduated to stealing beer and then robbing the bank. So the fact that you progress is not really an excuse or considered an insanity defense or diminished capacity in any way. The other one is multiple personality disorders. We like to talk about that. Can you consider the basis as an insanity defense? And it means that you have a host and a dominant. So the host is the person, and it's the person usually having the disease, and then you have dominant personalities within the multiple personality spectrum. Some of them are more docile and some of them are more aggressive. Did the more aggressive one commit the crime, and what was their mens rea? Because you can't really convict the docile one if their mens rea didn't meet the legal standard. Maybe the docile one was defending themselves and they killed someone accidentally. Just because they're insane doesn't mean that they did it on purpose, right? Or that they're unfit to stand trial. Maybe they're just innocent. Maybe the docile personality was defending themselves in that moment. Or maybe the instigator drove the docile one crazy to the point of losing total touch with reality. It was so sudden and just strange and unwanted, and it just drove them to the point of murder. Well, they would probably be acquitted because they didn't really have the mens rea necessary for that. Or let's say it was the dominant personality that was an agonist and wanted to really harm people, and they committed the crime and they planned it and they executed. Even though the person is multiple personalities, they would still be found guilty and not acquitted because that dominant personality really did take charge and took control there, and this host allowed that personality to take control here, and that personality would sort of be found guilty for having the necessary mens rea. Now there's an approach to gauge an insanity defense, and that basically is whether or not you want to first find out the person has a mental illness. Do they have mental retardation, and is it an involuntary intoxication? Those issues, if they're there, then you can test them. You can use the McNaughton test, the irresistible impulse test, the model penal code test, the Durham test, and the mens rea approach. And if they pass those, then they will most likely be acquitted, and if they don't, then they could be found guilty or there could be no defense available there. How do you distinguish between voluntary or involuntary intoxication? Well, involuntary intoxication would mean, let's say I'm a doctor and I give you a pill and you take that pill, and you normally take the pill for an antibiotic, and I don't tell you that that pill has a side effect that makes you go bananas, or it reacts with your body chemistry in a way that makes you go bananas and you murder your children and your husband and your neighbor, right? and you have this glorious bloodbath, and when you come off of this medication, you suddenly realize what you did, you had no control over yourself, well, you would probably be acquitted and found temporarily insane due to the medication. Now let's say I give you medication to control psychopathic behavior and you take it every day and you're fine and dandy. You're a lovely, delightful person, but one day you decide, I don't want to take this, it gives me a headache. And because you decide not to take the medication, you go nuts and you murder everyone in the house and the neighbor too and their dog, and you have a bloodbath, and then you try to argue insanity. Well, you would not be found, you would not be acquitted because you wanted to not take the medication. The fact that you stopped yourself from taking the medication was the volitional act. You knew that if you didn't take the medication, you would probably have a bloodbath because that is a documented behavior that you've had before, and there was a remedy for that, and you took away that remedy wantedly and recklessly and did so negligently. So it would, and then it instituted a criminal act, well then you would be found guilty. Now let's say that we want to test insanity, right? So one of the things we would do is we would use the McNaughton test, and that's basically that under the McNaughton test, a cognitive test, a defendant is to be acquitted if you find that the nature and quality of their act, right, did not, that their mental impairment did not know the nature and quality. They didn't know. They didn't know that swinging their knife in the air was going to cause a bloodbath. They didn't know that moving the knife could cut someone. They didn't know that if the person bled to death, they would die. So that means that you also don't know that the act was wrong. So you don't know that stabbing someone and swallowing your knife and killing them and having a bloodbath is bad because it kills people. And see, if you're totally disconnected and you don't understand those facts, then you'll probably be acquitted. But if you knew that swinging your knife and cutting in the air could potentially cut someone, you accidentally cut them and you didn't mean to, and you did so because you stopped taking your medication and it caused you to have these arm seizures, but you were holding a knife and you know the consequences of that, well then you would not be forgiven. You would be found guilty and they would lock you up, right? So now let's talk about the definition and nature and quality of an act. That means that you don't know the nature and quality of the act. It's the physical nature and consequences of that act, right? So that's what that kind of means. You have to have insight into the nature of a crime. And you know, the definition of wrong, that means that it should be defined under the McNaughton test, and wrong is defined as to mean legally wrong or morally wrong. Legally wrong means that you're not supposed to murder, you're not supposed to steal, you're not supposed to commit these acts. That's legally wrong. If you don't know that, and you don't know that stealing is wrong because you've never been told that, you lived in a cave, you were locked up, or maybe you lived in a basement, maybe your parents punished you and locked you in the basement for 10 years and didn't give you enough food and light and shelter and love, and all of a sudden you're let out into society and they just casually drop you off somewhere in the middle of some city in California, and you decide to go and stab every Tom, Dick, and Harry, then you may not be found guilty because of your history there. You don't know the difference between legally and morally wrong, so how could you possibly crucify that person, right? So then there's the legal wrong approach, and that, it's kind of like we're talking about common law here versus the model penal code, right? So the difference between those two. And now there's also this idea of maybe did God tell them to do this, And if God told them to do this, did they know that what they were doing was wrong? Because if God tells you to go and murder 10 people, and you go and murder 10 people, and you know that murdering them is wrong, and you know that's legally wrong, and you know what murder is, well then you would probably not be acquitted. But if you don't know, God tells you to do it, and you're raised in that cave in a basement somewhere, and you hear this voice, this omnipotence, and tells you to do it, and you do it, then you might be found acquitted, and they might let you go. So, and then there's the moral wrong approach. That means that it's morally wrong. So there's a loss of control. Under most applications of the McNaughton test, the defendant's ability or inability to control his or her conduct isn't really relevant. McNaughton says that your ability to control your conduct doesn't really matter here, okay? That's beside the point. It's basically just focusing on do you understand the difference between legal and moral and the quality and nature of your acts and the consequences of those acts? That's the McNaughton test. Now let's talk about the loss of control test. That's basically the defendant shows sufficient cognitive impairment, usually as required under the McNaughton test. Okay. Now there's the irresistible impulse test. That means I have this irresistible impulse to fling my arm up, right? And somebody stands behind me, I don't know they're behind me, I fling my arm up and I break their nose and it injures them and kills them. Well, I don't have medication, maybe the doctor never told me, and I have this irresistible impulse. Well, I'd probably not be found guilty, I'd be acquitted because it was involuntary, it was unknown, I didn't know the consequence, I didn't know somebody was behind me, and quite frankly, it was accidental, right? Now, but let's say that I have this irresistible impulse and I'm given medication for it and I'm supposed to control it and I decide not to take it. And then I have this irresistible impulse and it causes damages. If I know someone's standing behind me and I'm doing this, or even if I don't know they're standing behind me because I had medication that could control it and I harm someone, then that was wantonly and disregard, and there was total lack of regard for human life there. I mean, I'm really doing this in a very sloppy manner, right? So, and then there's the model penal code test. That's basically lack of substantial capacity to control oneself. Do you lack the capacity to control yourself? Can you turn yourself off, right? That's the lack of capacity to turn yourself. Once you turn that switch on, you know, do you go into this rage and you can't stop yourself? That could then lead to an acquittal depending on the circumstances. So you would build a case around that. Then there's the mens rea approach. The mens rea approach is an alternative. Basically, you substitute an explicit authorization for the defendant to use evidence of mental impairment to show that they did not have the mens rea required to commit the crime. That means that you submitted enough evidence. I've submitted all the psychological reports, the McNaughton test, all this other stuff. You would use the mens rea approach to show that, you know, they just didn't have, they weren't thinking along those terms when that happened. And it could just be to have enough comments from people or enough evidence from people to show that they just weren't in that capability of mind. Maybe enough people saw them and know that you were not in that state of mind when the crime occurred. So, and then maybe you snapped and everybody saw that you were pushed to that point. So that could show that just there's a disconnect. There was no planning, malice, and forethought to commit a crime. So that is basically the mens rea approach, and one court has held that this approach denies defendants federal due process, right? So again, the summary of the insanity defenses: we have the McNaughton test, the irresistible impulse test, the model penal code, the Durham test, and the mens rea approach. And the McNaughton is a cognitive test that we give. The irresistible impulse is the loss of control test. That means that they lost control of that impulse. There is a model penal code that is basically a combination of cognitive and loss of control. So the model penal code uses those two portions to show an acquittal or to excuse somebody from a crime. There's also the Durham test, and that's a causation test. Did your volitional movements cause damage? Did the fact of flicking the wrist, was the damage caused from that volitional, from that irresistible impulse, or from this mental deficiency? Did my mental inability to control myself cause the damages that I'm being sued for or criminally held liable for? And then there's also the mens rea or state of mind test. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to our next video.